oil provided the edge that led to the Allied victory in World War I. And immediately thereafter, the strategic importance of oil was clear worldwide. And this led to the global race for the exploration and refining of oil worldwide. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we continue to trace the history of oil past World War I, leading up to World War II. Between 1911 and 1918, the demand for oil in America increased by 90%, and the number of registered cars went from 1.8 to 9.2 million from 1914 through 1920. George Otis Smith, the director of the U.S. Geological Survey, warned that the known American reserves would be gone in exactly 9 years and 3 months, which would be around about the year 1930. And this fear led to America pushing its oil companies to look for oil outside of the United States. And that meant the Middle East. Standard Oil of New Jersey, which was headed by Walter Teagle, was supposed to act as a spokesperson for American oil companies and carry out negotiations in the Middle East with representatives from Royal Dutch Shell, Anglo-Persian, etc. Calouste Gulbenkian died in 1955 as one of the richest men on earth. The source of his fortune, a 5% cut from the oil in the Middle East. Since the British had struck oil in Iran in 1908, they were sitting pretty comfy thinking that all of the Middle East belonged to them. But in 1912, even before World War I, they became suspicious when they found that the Turkish Petroleum Company was operating in the same area with respect to concessions. Concessions is the term given to a grant that is extended by a government to permit a company to explore for and produce oil or gas within a geographic region. So the access to the Middle East oil depended strictly on the ability of these companies to get concessions from the respective governments. Now, the Turkish Petroleum Company had 50% of its shares owned by Deutsche Bank and Royal Dutch Shell. And the remaining 50% was owned by the Turkish National Bank, which incidentally was a British-controlled bank with 30% stake owned by the Armenian millionaire Calouste Gulbenkian. So around 1914, Gulbenkian brought together the British, that is the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the Germans, that's the Deutsche Bank, and Royal Dutch Shell, and he gave away his stake to these guys and was left with 5%. But in essence, what he told them was, you guys discover oil together, but I must get 5% of the proceeds. And that, in essence, gave him the nickname Mr. 5%. But all this happened before World War I. And immediately after, in 1914, World War I broke out, and the signatories met again in 1919 at the San Remo Conference. And since Germany had been defeated in World War I, the share of Germany was transferred to France. And this is the time when Walter Teagle also came into the picture to bid for American share in the Middle East, and America ended up getting 20% of that share. The clause of 5% still remained, so the Americans, the British, the French, they were free to explore oil in that region, but Gulbenkian still was supposed to get 5%. However, what was the boundary? Where could these guys operate? Calouste Gulbenkian took a red pencil and drew it around the erstwhile Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire no longer existed after World War I, But Gulbenkian insisted that the TPC control still existed on the original Ottoman Empire. So he drew a red line around the Gulf of the Middle East, which covered Saudi Arabia, Iraq, etc. The only countries left out were Iran and Kuwait. And this came to be known as the Red Line Agreement, and this opened the doors for American companies to export oil in the Middle East. So while all the major oil companies are scrambling for oil in the Middle East, an individual by the name of Dad Joyner steps into East Texas on a hunch from a friend by the name of Doc Lloyd, who's a self-proclaimed geologist, that there has to be oil in East Texas because he thinks that all the trend lines from all the major oil fields in America are somehow leading up to East Texas. And he shows Joyner where exactly to drill for oil. So Joyner starts drilling for oil. This is around about year 1930. And he's got just a few supporters. But in September 1930, one of the areas tests positive for oil. And October 3, 1930, a huge gusher with oil and water comes out of one of the derricks. And 6 months later, the area is producing 340,000 barrels per day, with a new well being drilled almost by the hour. Within 8 months, East Texas was drilling 0.5 million barrels a day. The scale in East Texas was so huge that it could easily be compared to Saudi Arabia. And it was not discovered by any major oil company, but by two individuals. Now, the East Texas oil discovery led to a flood of oil in the United States. And as a result, the oil prices began to fall nationwide. And it became such an emergency that Governor Bill Murray had to declare a state of emergency, and in August 1931, he even ordered the state militia to take control and close some of the major fields to prevent the oil prices from falling beyond $1 a barrel. And subsequently, FDR declared oil a national resource and put in some safeguards around about export and transport across states. And subsequently, the Connolly Hot Oil Act of 1935 was passed, which set some quotas between states so that there wasn't over production, over distribution, and over exports of oil. So some controls and safeguards were placed, and they stayed around for a good amount of time. So while countries like America, Russia, Great Britain, etc. are discovering more and more oil, getting the oil surpluses, two countries that have imperialist ambitions are trying to break into this market: Japan and Germany. Through the early 1920s, Japan had a functioning parliamentary system. But in the early 1930s, Japan's military came to dominate the government, and Japan embarked on a course of imperial expansion in East Asia. Now, the core reason for this expansion was getting more access to natural resources, especially oil, because they'd seen the example of Germany's defeat in World War I due to lack of access to oil. And to gain access to oil, they had two key options. One, Russia, and the second, the Dutch East Indies and other islands in the Pacific. By the 1930s, Japan produced only 7% of the oil that it consumed. 80% came from the US and 10% from the Dutch East Indies. So Japan began to establish self-sufficiency with respect to natural resources and break its dependence on the US with respect to oil, because it was worried that based on its aggression in China, there was a possibility of an oil embargo from the West. America feared that if the British withdrew from the East Indies, the entire area would be open to Japanese occupation. So it transferred its fleet from its base in Southern California to Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. The move was to give support to the British as well as serve as a deterrent to Tokyo. After the Nazi invasion of Western Europe, the National Defense Act was passed in the United States and signed by FDR on July 2, 1940, and this gave the president the power to control exports. Subsequently, the Japanese cabinet was reconstructed under the new Prime Minister Konoye, and he appointed the military general Hideki Tojo, whose nickname was the Razor, as war minister. So Japan's intentions were now pretty clear. Subsequently, the commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleets, Admiral Yamamoto, who was Harvard educated, devised a plan for attacking Pearl Harbor. His primary goal was to give a knockout punch to the US and disable the naval fleet and subsequently impact the morale of the general public. In early 1941, rumors started floating in the diplomatic circles about Japan attacking Pearl Harbor. But that was discounted by the US that such an audacious assault was not possible. And the primary reason for that was around about that time, there were also negotiations going on at the diplomatic level between Secretary of State Cordell Hull and the Japanese ambassador, Admiral Nomura. So Japan continued its imperial advance in Southeast Asia, and finally on July 25, 1941, the US ordered all Japanese financial assets in the US frozen, which essentially meant that there was no more money for Japan to buy oil from the US. So a lot of diplomatic discussions happened between the US and Japan to break the embargo, and in the meantime, in Japan, Hideki Tojo, the Razor, became prime minister. And subsequently, on November 26, 1941, the Japanese naval task forces secretly set sail for Hawaii. Around 8 a.m. on December 7, 1941, bombs began to fall on the American fleet in Pearl Harbor. The attack was completely unexpected, and 2 waves of Japanese aircraft destroyed 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 4 destroyers, and 4 auxiliary aircraft, and as a result, 2,335 American servicemen were killed, and 68 civilians lost their lives as well. The American aircraft carriers survived only because they were out on a mission at sea. Japan lost only 29 planes. Admiral Yamamoto's gamble had paid off. Japan, however, made one grave mistake. They left alone the oil supplies and repair facilities on the island of Oahu. All the oil on the island had been transported from the mainland. So had the Japanese plane destroyed the oil reserves and tanks holding them at Oahu, they would have immobilized every ship of the US Pacific Fleet, not just those that they destroyed. So though the Japanese created a lot of destruction, they failed to immobilize the US Navy. And that would be a big factor as the war progressed. Now let's shift attention to Germany and see what they've been up to in the run-up towards World War II. IG Farben, the biggest chemical company in all of Europe. It was formed in 1925 from a merger of 6 chemical companies, which included BASF, Bayer, Hext, and Agfa. In 1931, one of its scientists, Frederick Bergius, and Chairman Bosch shared the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the invention of the hydrogenation method to produce high-grade petroleum fuel from coal and hydrogen at high temperature and pressure. The invention of a synthetic method to produce petroleum fuel. Since Germany still didn't have oil of its own, I.G. Farben had argued that synthetic fuels from coal could cut Germany's dependence on foreign oil. And when Adolf Hitler became chancellor in January of 1933, he completely endorsed the idea, because his vision of New Germany involved autobahns, the limited access highways without speed limits, and the Volkswagen, the people's car. The German government commenced in building the Nazi war machine, the bombers, fighter planes, tanks, trucks, that all depended on oil. And as a result, the synthetic fuels from I.G. Farben became a very important strategic source. Now at this time, to put things in perspective, coal supplied 90% of Germany's energy, while oil accounted only for 5%. And around this time also, there was the discovery of the East Texas oil. And as a result, the production and distribution of oil became very, very economical. So the synthetic oil production ended up being 10 times the price per gallon of oil from the Gulf of Mexico. So the only hope the synthetic oil had of survival was providing the aviation fuel from the hydrogenation process, which could be used by the German military. By 1938, I.G. Farben had become an arm of Nazi Germany. All the Jewish officials had been removed, and even Karl Bosch, who had signed an agreement with Standard Oil, had been removed. So by the time Germany started World War II in Europe with the invasion of Poland in September of 1939, 14 hydrogenation plants were in operation. And by 1940, the synthetic oil output was 72,000 barrels per day, approximately 46% of the total oil supply. But this was still short supply compared to what the rest of Europe and America were producing at the time. So Hitler came up with the concept of blitzkrieg, meaning lightning war. So the strategy behind the lightning war was invade quickly, get a quick decisive victory before you run out of petroleum. And this strategy worked. Not only in Poland in 1939, but also in spring of 1940 when Hitler's forces overran Norway. And then on June 22, 1941, Hitler decided to invade Russia. And more importantly, he was eyeing the oil-rich resource in Baku. The oil fields of Baku were his prime target. So towards the end of 1941, the US had a surplus of oil. Japan had temporarily crippled its naval fleet and was eagerly eyeing the oil resources in the East Indies. Germany had found success in its blitzkrieg across Western Europe and was quickly eyeing the oil fields of Baku. So were both Japan and Germany successful in getting access to this crucial resource of oil as they headed into 1942? We'll find that out in the next episode. Moving on to the quiz section of the program. The question from the previous episode: looking at the antitrust cases from the 20th century, which was the second company after Standard Oil to undergo an antitrust ruling? Was it A. Kodak, B. AT&T, C. Microsoft, or D. Google? In 1921, the US government concluded that Eastman Kodak had monopolized the amateur photography market in violation of the Section 2 of the Sherman Act by buying competitors and imposing various forms of exclusive dealing contracts on retailers. The 1921 decree barred Kodak from preventing dealers from selling goods freely produced by competitors. So the answer is A. Kodak. The question for this episode: who is the top oil producing country in the world today? Is it A. Saudi Arabia, B. Russia, C. Canada, or D. the US? Once again, who is the top oil producing country in the world today? A. Saudi Arabia, B. Russia, C. Canada, or D. the United States? And it's time to conclude this episode. Looking forward to following Japan, Germany, and the rest of the world in their quest for oil through the remainder of World War II and beyond. Till then, stay safe and keep looking for the why in history.